Hi everyone, welcome to the fourth and final session of the seminar Modern Monetary Theory, the 16th Century Challenge by Colin Drumm. I am now going to pass the mic to Colin.
All right, hi everyone. So we're going to be wrapping up today. I tried to tie this into some sort of a bow that we can take with you. It's not enough time in this seminar for us to really adequately address all of this. I know it's been a lot of reading. But what I'm kind of hoping is that you'll kind of walk away from this seminar with at least a better appreciation of the kind of problem that we're dealing with when we talk about monetary politics. Whether or not we've solved it, at least we know what the problem actually is. Because I think that a lot of times the problem about this is sort of misrepresented by the NNT school and by its opponents as being a sort of a problem about a technical apparatus or about an ontological problem. I mean, what really scandalizes people about modern monetary theory is this ontological problem, this idea that they, want to believe that there's the substance of value and the idea that money might be independent or kind of unconstrained by these immanent laws of the economy seems scandalous to them. But what I've been trying to suggest by kind of putting these readings together for you is to try to give you an understanding of monetary politics as being a political struggle about distribution, about different classes in society, and one which we can't really reduce to a pure question of technical apparatus or something like that, right? So, okay, so today I want to talk about Jacobean finance, which is really where we've been leading up. And I want to try to place Henry V and how in Henry V as being Shakespeare's commonly understood to be Shakespeare's ideal ruler, right? How represents for Shakespeare what he thinks the model of ideal rulership is in a way that is kind of a critique of late Elizabethan the problems of the late Elizabethan state, which become the problems of the Stewart state a little bit after this play is written. So this play precedes the accession of James I to the crown, but all of these problems were very much in the air even before his accession. So really, what is going to happen kind of 10, 15 years after Shakespeare writes this play is what we've read about in Cramsey, which is what's called the failure of the great contract. And essentially what this was an attempt by James to get Parliament to allow him to solve the debt issue through direct taxation. Okay, so what James was asking basically was in exchange for a regular parliamentary tax of £200,000 a year, right? So I think we mentioned last time Parliament previously was kind of called on irregularly on an ad hoc basis, right? So there was no regular yearly peacetime taxation. James could draw revenues from his crown lands, but the problem is by the time of late Elizabeth, James, there aren't many of the crown lands left, right? So we began with Richard II, and we examined this problem of the sale of crown lands as being one way to bridge a fiscal deficit. But the problem with that, obviously, is there's only so much that you can sell. And eventually you might have to seize lands from the church. You might have to seize lands from your barons, various different things, right? So we have this problem in which the king's own estates, which are what he's supposed to be drawing revenue from, have kind of been rendered insufficient to meet the military needs of the late 16th century, especially in the context of the Great Inflation, and so James is trying to in the 1610s is trying to get Parliament to give him this £200,000 a year, and what he's going to give up are some of these kind of medieval legacy revenue streams, so the wardships and purveyances and these kind of things, which don't need to concern us overly much. But the real issue becomes what the king is willing to give up to Parliament in order to receive this regular direct taxation, and whether or not the king can be bound by the promise that he makes to Parliament, right? This is really the fundamental issue, is whether the king can make a contract with Parliament that he would then be unable to break in the future. And if that's the case, what does that mean for sovereignty, right? What is that? It seems like it empties sovereignty of one of its essential properties, and this is sort of the issue. And what happens is that this attempt at the Great Contract fails. It's rejected both by James and by Parliament. They kind of both sides walk away from the negotiation, precisely on this issue of what the king was giving up to Parliament in exchange for direct taxation, and whether he could be bound to it. And so where Jacobean finance kind of goes after this is the attempt to raise revenue through projects, right? So essentially, public-private partnerships of the kind that our state is has been undergoing a kind of transformation of this nature of making up for the inability to fund works or projects of the state directly, and the kind of solution to this is seen to be, incentivizing the private sector, right? We need to incentivize the private sector by setting up projects in which the private sector can make a profit, and they'll split some of this profit with the state. This is sort of the path that James goes down. It doesn't work very well, and eventually we end up with the Civil War, and it's only after the Civil War or during the Civil War that the sort of foundations for direct peacetime taxation are laid. And as we saw last week when we on our discussion of James MacDonald, it's so in the Netherlands, in England, and also in the United States, direct taxation is only accomplished through a process of civil war, right? It's only in the American Civil War that we institute the federal income tax. So what I want to look at, and so as Cramsey argues, Cramsey attributes this failure of the Great Contract to a failure of James, a kind of contingent political failure to rule correctly. And so what I want us to kind of think about today is what role is the figure of Henry V playing for the late Elizabethan, early Tudor audience, and as sort of a critique or a contrast to James? How is Henry V being held out as sort of the way that the problem that James and Elizabeth are facing could be solved if they had the right kind of attitude towards ruling? And the reason that Henry V in particular takes on this role or plays this role in the 16th century imagination is because Henry V is basically the last time that there had been a balanced budget in England, right? Henry V essentially succeeds, as we saw in one of the readings, Henry V and the English Taxpayer. Henry V is kind of the last time the budget was balanced. So people kind of look back at him in a bit of the same way that liberals might look back on the Clinton administration, right? The Clinton surplus as being this mythical time in the past when the budget was balanced before we fell into into debt. Okay, and so the question is, what is it about Henry V that he did right that we could still do if we understood it? Right. This is kind of the question that I want us to think about. So what I want to begin, I want to throw some concepts on the table for us to think with, and these concepts are the concepts of of options and decisions. Okay, so on the one hand we have options, we have things that we could do, and on the other hand we have decisions. We have the closing of options, right? So a decision closes options. There's a relation between options and decisions in that way, and so we can, if we think about the problem of the Great Contract of being, can the king bind himself? Can he make a deal with Parliament to give up some of his rights and some of his powers and be bound to it? The question is the king really capable of giving up his options, right? If the king has an option to break the contract, if the king has an option to confiscate property, what is it that might enable him to be restrained in this option? And then there's the problem of, if the king is restrained in his options, then in what sense is he still a king? And if we think that the continuity of the political order depends upon the existence of kingship, then we have a kind of puzzle that we have to work through. And as I hope that you saw in the reading by Ray Kanamura, this issue is connected to the question of what makes a king a king. Is the king because of election, or is the king because of inheritance, right? So there is a question about whether the king possesses sovereignty by right of private inheritance. The question of whether sovereignty and the kingship are just one of any kind of private property. It's just another kind of private property that's passed down according to the law of private property. Or is the kingship a matter of election, in which case maybe if the king is being a tyrant, it would be legitimate to overthrow him. What makes the king would be rather than his personal property right, is sort of his ability to successfully uphold this or meet the needs of the state, right? So you have in theory of election, which is the older form of kingship, okay? Inheritance is the idea of kingship by inheritance develops later. But in the elective kingship, there's the idea that the right of the king to be king depends upon his ability to serve the Commonwealth, right? And so this makes him less stable than the king who rules by inheritance. And what's interesting is that the theory presented by the defenders of first Mary, Queen of Scots, James' mother, and then James, they ended up shifting. So early on, they're arguing that there is an elective kingship, and that is why it's okay to sort of pass over the maybe more direct lines of inheritance, because the issue is really about the issue is about election rather than pure inheritance. But later on in the kind of 1590s, the supporters of James shift their story, and they end up saying that James is a king by inheritance. And this creates a problem, because in order to create this regular peacetime taxation, which is sort of what there has to be if the king can't devalue the money in order to service his debts, he needs to be able to raise taxes. But if he's a king by inheritance, there is this resistance to allowing him to do so, because this would put him on the way to tyranny. So if the king is both a king by inheritance, which means that it is unlawful to depose him no matter what he does, and he has the power of direct taxation over anybody, regardless of who owns the land that they live on, then there's we've set up a tyrant who can tax us arbitrarily, and that's going to be a problem. Okay, so what I want to, I'm gonna try to fill you in on some of the English dynastic history that underlies the events of Henry V, because what I want to suggest to you is that there is a kind of isomorphism or some kind of a similarity between the logic of monetary systems and the logic of dynasty. And my basic move that I want to try to make you see the homology or the isomorphism between these kinds of systems is the problem of options and hedging. The question of what is the stability of the money versus the instability of the money, and what happens if the things that we do to try to stabilize the money have a counterintuitive effect of destabilizing it, right? So thinking about our own contemporary moment, we have a monetary crisis in 2007, 2008. The central bank undertakes efforts in order to stabilize the money, to hedge the money against the risk of a crisis. But the problem is that this action of the central bank introduces instability into our social order, and this is what we're living through now. Okay, so in the same way, there is a contradiction in the logic of dynasty, according to which the hedge is also a threat. Okay, so you can hedge the dynasty, and what you do to hedge the dynasty also is a threat to the dynasty. So our attempts to stabilize the dynasty to ensure its continuity might have the the opposite effect. They might be counter-performative rather than performative. And so in order to begin telling this story, we need to begin with Henry I. So Henry I is the fourth son of William the Conqueror. So I think we talked about this a little bit before. William the Conqueror, who is the Duke of Normandy, who is a subject. He is the Duke of Normandy and therefore a subject of the French king as Duke of Normandy, conquers England, becomes King of England. And the problem is that they have, William now has a bunch of different possessions that he owns, and he has four sons. And they live in the 11th century. There is no tradition of primogeniture, which means inheritance that goes solely to the firstborn male. And so William the Conqueror splits up his possessions and among his different sons. And so one of them gets England, one of them gets Normandy, and I forget exactly the third one, but Henry I, who's the fourth son, gets nothing. There isn't enough to go around. And what this produces is civil war, essentially. Soon after William the Conqueror's death, his sons go to war against one another in order to try to consolidate these possessions. And when the dust settles, essentially, William Rufus, who had inherited England, dies in a hunting accident, conveniently. I think with these things, I always suspect assassination, hunting accidents, like Game of Thrones, Robert Baratheon. So, which is, I think, modeled off on William Rufus, actually. And Henry crowns himself king of England because, so in the 11th century, basically, things worked a little differently, and whoever got to the chapel first and had themselves crowned king was now king. So once you did the ceremony, you got anointed, you had the crown. Now you're king, and it doesn't really matter whether it was legitimate or not, right? So Henry is in England when his older brother William Rufus dies, has himself crowned king, and then sort of has to fight a war with the other brothers of his other brother, who's the Duke of Normandy. And both of them have heirs who are both named William, and they're both hoping to put their son William on the throne of the United Angevin Empire. So the English kings eventually, once this is this consolidation of the patrimony of William the Conqueror is kind of accomplished, the English kings actually own a big chunk of France. They own all the way down to the Mediterranean, basically. So it's called the Angevin Empire. Now, what happens is that Henry I tries to avoid this, right? So Henry I is like, okay, I've seen so this is the problem of sons. The problem of sons is that the inheritance gets divided and it creates civil war, and also it whittles down the size and power of your holdings. And so Henry I very deliberately has only one legitimate son, whose name is William Adelin. And so he deliberately has only one son, and so that there won't be this question, because he's trying to unite the inheritance in a single house. The problem is that there is a disaster called the sinking of the White Ship, which essentially, basically the story is that the young Prince William Adelin and a bunch of his friends got on this ship. So like the whole court is going from England to France. But the William Adelin, the young prince, and his friends kind of get their own boat, and they all get wasted, and the boat sinks. Okay, so the White Ship sinks. William Adelin is dead, along with a bunch of other important figures in the court, and this is what leads to what's called the English anarchy. So after Henry I dies, he has no heir. There is a civil war between Stephen of Blois and the Empress Matilda. So the Empress Matilda is the daughter of Henry I. But there's resistance to crowning a woman to be the Queen of England. And so a bunch of powerful nobles prefer Stephen of Blois, who was kind of de facto King of England for a good while. But this entire time there's a civil war. And then Empress Matilda, who is the empress because she is married to the Holy Roman Emperor, she was married to him. He died, and she remarries a guy named Geoffrey, Count of Anjou, who is the father of Henry II. So there's a civil war. Eventually, the party of Matilda is victorious, and Henry II, Matilda's son, is installed on the throne, and he Henry II is sort of the basis for all of these. He is the one through which all of these later English kings claim the throne. But of course, the problem is that that means that they all claim the throne through the Empress Matilda. So all of the English kings hold the throne in what is called the cognatic line, or the female line, as opposed to the agnatic line, which means the line without any women in it. And this is the problem that is the basis of the next few hundred years of English history, including the War of the Roses. Okay, and so when Henry V, Shakespeare's play, opens with the scene in which the bishops are concerned about having their wealth taken away from them, and so they try to start a war. And the way that they try to start this war is to tell Henry V, look, you are actually the rightful king of France. Now, why? The reason is that so Henry V's great-grandfather is Richard III. So if we can remember, Edward III. So Edward III is the grandfather of Richard II. He's also the grandfather of Henry Bolingbroke, which makes him the great-grandfather of Henry V. And during Edward III's reign, the last direct Capetian French monarch died, who I believe is Charles VI. And Edward was actually the nearest male descendant of Charles V, Charles VI's father. But basically, the nobles in France didn't want the English king to inherit the throne, partly because and their excuse is that it's through the female line. So Edward III is I forget exactly, but he's the heir to the Capetians through the female line. And so the French dukes basically say, we're going to deny this claim that the English king has to the French crown, and we're going to put I forget which one of this other French king on the throne, the one who eventually goes on to found the French dynasty that you might know from modern French history. And so this is what starts the 100 Years' War, basically, is that Edward III says, yeah, I'm the king of France, and I'm going to regain my rightful possessions, and the French and the English fight on the continent for about 100 years. And so essentially in the beginning of Henry V, the bishops are trying to restart this war, and they're trying to show that Henry V is really the king of France in order to diffuse domestic social conflict, to diffuse conflict between the church and the king, and to kind of direct it outwards towards the continent. And as we learned in some of the secondary readings, right, it is really Henry V's success at Harfleur and at Agincourt which enable him to balance the budget, right? So essentially, Henry V is able to avoid these destabilizing internal social conflicts over taxation that had plagued Richard II and a bunch of his predecessors. Why? Well, because he's a war hero, and so he's sort of able to get people to consent to taxation because they are wrapped up in the excitement over his successful military campaigns on the continent. After basically many decades of English setbacks and defeats by the French. So the English had basically been reduced to holding only Calais. So Calais is the only English possession on the continent. But it's sort of, so Henry V goes on this tour, he lands at Harfleur, he makes this, he cuts his way through France, and then he defeats a much larger force of French knights. And famously, this is a turning point in European military tactics, because the English longbows defeat the armored French cavalry and all of this stuff. But what I want us to notice, so there is this in the beginning of Henry V, in scene 1-2, there's this discussion of the Salic law and the inheritance of the female. And what I want you to notice is that everything that is said about the French is also true of Henry. Okay, this is the irony in this scene, which is that every single thing that they are describing about the illegitimacy of the French claim, of the French king's claim to the French crown, is also true of Henry. This is the irony, okay? Because what is their argument, essentially? The argument is that Henry V has a superior claim to the French throne than the people who currently have it, because he is descended from the Capetians, but it is through the female line, okay? And what happens is that essentially the French lawyers are trying to figure out a way to defeat this, this claim to the French throne by the English king. And what they do is they dig up this thing called the Salic Law, which is essentially a product of the Carolingian Renaissance. So Charlemagne is kind of, this is 8th century, I forget exactly. And basically it was Charlemagne recognizing the independence of the laws of a different Frankish, the Salian Franks, as opposed to this other community of Franks. And he's sort of saying, okay, you have your own laws, we're going to recognize them. And one of these laws is the prohibition on female inheritance through the female line. So in the Salic Law, the only kind of succession that is allowed is agnatic succession. And so the French lawyers kind of say the Salic Law applies to France, so therefore the claim of Edward III and thus of Henry V to the French crown is illegitimate. As they point out in the text, this is kind of a made up legal thing, because the Salic Law was in a different place, right? They say this is actually Germany that you're talking about. The Salic Law doesn't apply at all. And how do we know that? Well, because all of the French kings hold their right through the female line. If you go back far enough into their claim to be kings, it goes through the female line, right? So we have these male line succession, and because male line succession is kind of a later legal idea, okay, it's sort of retroactively said that only the male line can inherit. The problem is that all of these dynasties, if you go back far enough, eventually there's a woman in the line of succession. So they're all actually descended from the female line, right? And the problem is, so what they're saying is, look, these French kings are descended from the female line. That's how they get their right. But they're trying to say that my right to the French crown is illegitimate because it's the female line. So therefore, it can't be. It's not a good argument. But the irony is that this exact same argument applies to Henry V, because the War of the Roses is soon, in a couple of decades, going to be fought over precisely the problem that Henry V claims the English throne in the female line, and there is a better claim to it in the House of York, right? So the House of Lancaster is the female line. It's superior to the House of York only if you count the female line, but if you are talking about direct succession, then the claim is not legitimate. And so, yeah, and so this is the problem. So what eventually happens, so now to bring the kind of problem into Shakespeare's time, the problem is that James I has the claim to the English throne through the daughter of Henry VII, Mary. So now, what is interesting about this is I want to think about the marriages of state. So politically motivated marriages, one of which this play ends with, right? So Henry V ends with the marriage of Catherine to Henry, and there's this whole problem about language, right? So there's a number of scenes in this play in which we explore a sort of linguistic exchange between French and English, which echoes, as I hope you remember from earlier plays, this. So think back to scene 1:1 of Richard II, where Mowbray is complaining that by being sent, away from England, he's being alienated from his mother tongue and all of this stuff, right? So, but here we have kind of the closing of that theme that is carried through the play with these various comedic scenes about French. But the point that I want to make is that we can think about the political marriage as the sale of an option on the crown, okay? And the fundamental problem is that if you restrict the exchange of women, like if you don't engage in these political marriages, or if you don't allow for the possibility of cognatic succession, if you don't have more than one son, then you subject the dynasty to a risk that it might die out, right? And if the male line dies out, then we have a civil war. This happens in English history. But the problem is that if we try to hedge against the possibility of the male heir dying out by having other sons or by exchanging women, we create options on the throne that hedge the possibility that the direct male line will die out, but it also creates the possibility for civil war, right? So civil war can result from the fact that we don't have any heirs, and it can also result from the fact that we have too many heirs. Both of these things threaten to produce civil war in the logic of dynasty. And this is the problem that Shakespeare is very much concerned about, obviously, because Elizabeth is going to die without an heir. Everybody knows this. And so, you know, and so it's this I'm really interested in this contradiction of the way in which, you know, like Henry I can try to hedge against the risk of the problem of sons by refusing to have any more sons, but then he creates a dynastic succession conflict. We can try to hedge against the extinction of the male line by allowing inheritance to go through the female. But now what do? As soon as we start trying to call in options for female inheritance, this threatens to explode the entire foundations of everybody's dynasty, because now there's all kinds, once you start allowing succession to go through the female line, it explodes in a huge way the number of different possible claimants, and it creates this huge problem. And yeah, so this is, I hope that kind of gives some background dynastic history to the problem that opens and closes Henry V. And okay, so that's options. And now I want to talk a little bit about indecision, which we talked a little bit about last time, but it comes out in a number of places in Henry V, and it is related to the problem of Plato's Politicus. So as we saw in some of the readings, James I was a very avid reader of Plato's Politicus, which is normally translated statesman. And the basic problem of Plato's statesman is that he wants to know whether the ruler is above or below the law. Okay, it is a precursor to Carl Schmitt, to political theology, to the problem of decision into the law. And so this is the whole issue of whether the king is above or below the law, whether the king can intervene to break the law, whether the king is bound by the law. This is a text that James was very obsessed with personally, and I see it as a text that Shakespeare is sort of indirectly engaging with in his presentation of the figure of Henry V. And so if on the one hand we have options, and we have the problem that both the lack and the overabundance of options have this tendency to destabilize the political order, the transmission of property and kingship. And on the other hand, we have decisions, which is the ability to arbitrarily decide to break the law or not, right? So if we have this problem that there are female line heirs, and they're out of the money options in the sense that they can't necessarily can't be exercised now, but they might come into the money later, right? So when Henry VII marries his daughter Mary to the Scottish king, he's selling him an option on the English crown that comes into the money a few generations later. And now we have the problem of, okay, we have to decide whether to recognize these claims or not. So we have a proliferation of options, and then we have the necessity of deciding to recognize some options or to close down other options. And what I want us to think about are a number of scenes in Henry V in which Henry shows his power as a king by leaving open the option of whether he is a Christian king or a tyrant. Okay, so he begins in the opening scenes of the play, says, I'm a Christian king. I'm not a tyrant. But what does he end up doing? I mean, so first of all, he raises the town of Harfleur. He executes all these prisoners in the Battle of Agincourt. And in particular, I want to look at the scene in scene 2:2, where he turns on these traitors who have accepted bribes in order to betray him. So what I think is particularly interesting about this scene is, so I'm looking at this is 2:2. Begins around line 44, and a Scroop says, "That's mercy, but too much security." So I think if you search in the text for "too much security," you'll find where I am. And so essentially, what happens here in this scene is that the king knows that Scroop and Grey and Cambridge, his advisors, are in the pay of the French king. They have accepted, as he says, light crowns for their service. So anyway, so what he's saying there when he says light crowns is he's saying, not only have you betrayed me, but you've betrayed me for bad money. You're not even getting good money for what for selling me out. But the king is not yet revealing that he knows that they are traitors. So when the scene begins, the king's friends are like, "Oh, he trusts these traitors too much. What's he doing? This is dangerous. Why haven't we punished these people already?" But he brings the traitors in, and the first thing that they do is consider this problem of the man committed yesterday that railed against our person, right? So essentially what has happened is there's been a soldier who was saying bad things about the king, and he's been arrested and put into chains. And the question is, what are we going to do about this guy? And the king says, "Uncle of Exeter, enlarge the man," enlarge meaning free the man committed yesterday that railed against our person. We consider it was an excess of wine that set him on, and on his more advice we pardoned him. Okay, so the king says, "I'm going to exercise mercy against this common soldier." And what does Scroop say? "That's mercy, but too much security. Let him be punished, sovereign, lest example breed by his sufferance more of such a kind." Okay, so Scroop says you can't set a bad example. The whole point of punishment is to deter crimes in the future, and if you exercise mercy, this is going to weaken your position. Of course, the irony is that in just a moment, when the king hands them letters, which are supposed to be their commissions, it's supposed to be their instructions, but really what they actually say is that he's condemning them to death, and he watches their faces fall, and then all of a sudden they're begging mercy for themselves. And so of course, if the king applies the rule that these advisors have just been pressing on him, then he's going to execute them. And there is this. Here we go. Where is it? And what he eventually says is that, I can't find the thing. He says if the eye that winks at treason, how could it stretch to see this? My apologies. I've lost this. Here we go. So this is 2:2, about 53. The king says, "Alas, your too much love and care of me are heavy orisons against this poor wretch. If little faults proceeding on distemper shall not be winked at, how shall we stretch our eye when capital crimes, chewed, swallowed, and digested, appear before us?" Okay, so he's hinting at this, that he knows that they've committed treason. And what's his point? His point is that if I don't wink at this petty crime, then by the same standard, how big would my eye have to stretch? And if we're talking about real crimes, we're talking about high treason. So he's saying, well, I have to sort of forgive these petty crimes, because it's only then that I can sort of make this distinction between petty crimes, just some slander, some soldier slandering me because I'm drunk, versus my own advisors betraying me to the French. And so, yeah, I have to have mercy on this guy, and so that I can hold in reserve my power to punish something that's real, right? And so we have two different ideas about what is the power that the king exercises through punishment, right? Is the power that the king exercises through punishment the establishment of a rule that can't be broken, right? If you do something wrong, I will punish you no matter what. And in this conception, the option for mercy is seen to threaten the rule, to destabilize the rule. The other conception, so that this is the conception that Scroop urges on the king, but the king's conception is different. The king's conception is that the option for mercy, the option to decide not to punish, is in fact not a kind of weakness, but a source of strength. Now, what's interesting is that this fits uneasily with some other things that Henry V says. For example, in scene 3-3. Which is the siege of Harfleur. So in 3-3, this is about line 19, the king says, "What is it to me when you yourselves are cause, if your pure maidens fall into the hand of hot and forcing violation? What reign can hold licentious wickedness when down the hill he holds his fierce career?" Okay, what is he saying here? He's saying essentially, so he's landed unexpectedly on the French coast. He's surrounded the town of Harfleur, and he's giving them an ultimatum. He's saying, either you have to surrender the town, or we're going to, rape and loot all of the people in the town, and the choice is yours. I have no power of my own to decide. I've simply offered you the ultimatum, and any culpability for this is on your head, right? It's your fault. You are doing this wrong thing if you don't submit, and I have no responsibility for it, even though I'm the one who's actually doing all of this stuff, right? So, and I'm reminded of the experience participating in the strike at University of California, Santa Cruz recently. I mean, the administration has very much of the same gesture, right? They say, you are hurting the undergrads, by striking, and we have nothing to do with it, even though it's their refusal to meet our, So there's this question of this contest of ultimata, and the question of who's ultimately responsible, right? Are you responsible because you don't give in to my ultimatum, et cetera, right? And so this problem is runs throughout the entire play. So just a gesture at another passage where this kind of problem is explored, and we'll look at this more closely later, I hope, is the exchange with Williams. So remember that the king uses his ability to circulate among the lower classes to disguise himself as an ordinary soldier, and he goes and has this exchange with Williams. And what the exchange hinges on is the question of whether the king is responsible for the deaths of his soldiers, right? And so Williams kind of says, it's if your cause isn't just, then basically it's you're now going to have to bear on your soul the weight of all of these dead soldiers. And the king says, no, it's not my responsibility if the soldiers die. I'm not the one who wanted them to die, right? I mean, I didn't intend for them to die when I brought them to France and all this stuff, right? So there's this question of like, who bears responsibility for things, and the way in which actors can try to seek power by putting the responsibility of the choice on somebody else, right? This is sort of the gesture of the ultimatum. Now, so what I think is interesting is that Henry V, he is always changing his theory of this, right? He is able to, at a moment, as the situation demands, he's able to decide between different philosophies of responsibility, of choice, of agency, and he's always has the option, and this is how he uses power, is to avoid committing himself to any particular decision about whether he is or is not above the law, right? So this is the so maybe the way that I would want to put this is that in Plato's Statesman, the object of the dialogue, and it's an aporia, they don't succeed at this, they fail in their project, but the project is to find the rule or the art by which the politicus or the statesman can decide over the exception, right? So there's a rule, there's the necessity for the exception. And the question is there some kind of art by which the statesman can decide whether to follow the rule or not in a given instance? And at the end of the dialogue, the Socrates and the interlocutor decide that they can't find one, and so it's better for the king to be below the law, because we don't really know how to decide. And so I read the figure of Henry V as being a kind of Deleuzean inverted Plato statesman. Okay, so if you know a little bit about Deleuze, the project of Deleuze is to invert Plato. So in Plato, the essence comes before appearance, and in Deleuze, appearance comes before essence. Throughout the Deleuze's project, there's this idea of inverting Plato. And I kind of take up this basic Deleuzean gesture of the inverted Plato, and I suggest that what Shakespeare presents in Henry V is an inverted Platonic statesman, not somebody who has the rule or the art of deciding, when to intervene in the law or not, but rather the sort of the art of the statesman as presented by Shakespeare is the power of indecision, right? Henry V has always not yet decided about whether he is a tyrant or a Christian king, right? About whether he is going to pay the debt that he has never promised, or whether he's going to repudiate the debt that he did promise, right? And I think kind of what Shakespeare shows us is that power resides in this moment of indecision, in the fact that we don't yet know what the king has decided. And the king, so in the way that he relates to Scroop in this scene, right? He's holding open for himself the potential to decide later in the future, right? So rather than with Carl Schmitt seeing the essence of sovereignty in the decision, in the moment of deciding, what I'm suggesting is that in a way, once the king decides, now there's more problems, right? The king has collapsed his option. He has made a decision, and this is actually sort of undermining the power of the king. Think about in Henry IV Part 2, which we discussed last time, the way in which there's this worry that if Henry IV punishes the rebels, then that will create more rebellion in the future, right? So this decision has the potential to actually collapse the power of the sovereign. And I think what Shakespeare is kind of showing in Henry V is that real sovereignty is not the decision, but rather indecision. Sovereignty is the power to wait until you decide, and it is precisely the anxiety that your subjects feel about what you will decide to do that makes them subjected to you. Now, what is the upshot of this? The upshot of this is that if we come to understand the outcome of the English 17th century as the subordination of sovereignty to the financial, to the demands of finance, in which the king gives up all of his options. The king gives up the option to debase the currency. The king gives up the option to repudiate his debt. The king gives up the option for extraordinary seizure of property of his subjects. The king is emptied of all of his sovereignty. And the problem is whether that itself might not contribute a kind of instability into the social order. So in a way that I think is very much our problem today, right? If we think about structural transformations of the United States since the crisis of the 70s, in which the United States becomes the world's biggest debtor state. Why? Well, because the United States debt is the money of the world, and so the United States needs to go more and more into debt so the rest of the world can have enough money. And if we see this as kind of the abdication of sovereignty, rather than as the assertion of sovereignty, but rather as a kind of abdication of sovereignty, as a kind of becoming powerless of sovereignty, this, I think, reframes the way in which we think about the problems of monetary politics. So think back to our second session when we were discussing Boyer-Xambeau, and we were talking about the French king who was faced with the problem of unit of account deflation. So he's faced with the problem that he has power because the Lyon Fair is the financial center of Europe, basically, and he gets something from this. But what he has to kind of give up in order to support this exchange is his power to decide how much his money is worth. And the problem is that if the money gets worth too much, gets too expensive, then this causes problems for his domestic economy because the debts increase in value, and you're going to have this problem of servicing the debts. And so what does the French king do? He devalues his unit of account. And what happens? Well, the financial center flees, right? And so the king asserts his sovereignty against the financial center. And what happens? Well, the finance flees him. And right, and so there's this problem of, so if we think about the ways that the Elizabeth is trying to court finance, and so once you start funding the state through borrowing money, and long-term finance becomes centrally integrated into the tax state, the state has to change its nature, and it has to change from a sovereignty has to change from something that is royal, something that is the possession of an individual, to something that is kind of a structural function of the state, which is impersonal and which is sort of above and beyond the sort of individual contingent person who occupies that position. And what this move is fundamentally about, this is so tie it into the things I began by saying, right? I mean, what this move is fundamentally about is about getting rid of this pesky problem of dynastic volatility, right? The problem is, this is the reason that you can't have long-term debt, is because dynasty is too volatile. And you as a creditor simply cannot know that the dynasty will continue and that the king will inherit the debt of his predecessor and will service it. And so this makes lending to sovereigns an inherently risky business, okay? Lending to sovereigns is inherently risky because dynasty is inherently unstable. And we can see this through the history of England. What changes in the modern monetary regime is that lending to sovereigns becomes inherently safe, as we read in Boyer. Okay, and what this requires a couple of different things to happen, which fundamentally change the nature of the state. One is that we get rid of this problem of dynasty risk, and what replaces it? What replaces it is the idea that the chief executive of the state serves at the pleasure of Parliament, of the public, and can be dismissed, can be fired, executed, dismissed if they don't do their job. And the second is the development of direct taxation, okay? And so these things have to go together in order for long-term stable public financing to be possible, which is the basis of the modern financial order. And this is kind of, what I think is important about this is that it's a little counterintuitive, because we might think that taxation is a kingly thing, right? That income tax, the king is powerful because he has the ability to tax. But I think what the history that we've been studying kind of shows is that the king really, the king did not have the power to tax in any kind of meaningful way, and that is the problem. And it's sort of only once we ritually execute the king and in a way repeat the ritual execution of the king every 4 years in our elections, that is what makes it possible to have income tax, long-term debt, and is what makes the entire modern monetary order possible, right? And so the main difference between the way that I'm framing this problem and I think the way that this problem is normally framed is that I am trying to reorient this analysis, not around the power of the sovereign, not around, as MMT puts it, right, the sheer power of the sovereign to print money whenever it wants to define what money is. This is what they emphasize. So their discourse is all about the power of the sovereign. And the puzzle for them is, why doesn't the sovereign exercise its power? If the sovereign has the power to print money and everything, then why doesn't it? And this is what they, And so what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to reframe the problem. I'm saying, look, the modern monetary order is not really founded on the power of sovereignty. In fact, it is founded on the impotence of sovereignty. And the sovereign must be impotent in order to make any of this possible. And once we begin thinking about it this way, the way we think about the problem kind of changes. And it maybe, I think, as we touched on briefly last time at the end of our discussion, maybe gives us some new insight into exactly why we are living through this a Trumpian moment in the aftermath of not only the crisis of the 70s, but also 2008 and its consequences, precisely because the problem there is the impotence of the sovereign, and the impotence of the sovereign to intervene into debt and money and finance in order to keep society from destroying itself by becoming so indebted forever and ever until it collapses. Okay. So I just laid a lot on the table. I don't think we have any presentations today, so I'm be curious if you have any responses to the kind of the stuff I just said. And there's some more scenes in Shakespeare that I'd like to look at. Also, this is a very rich play. I hope you enjoyed reading it. So, I don't know, anybody have any responses to what I just said? Used. Yeah.
I do actually. I just like want to make sure I'm understanding.
Yeah, I mean, stupid questions are great too. I like stupid questions. So if you have stupid questions, ask them. Yeah.
Well, this question of like, and this is sort of like in the current moment, like you brought us up to the Trumpian moment. Like, is there like when you say at the end, like the sort of risk of society collapsing on itself due to sort of like a just becoming more and more indebted. There's like something really fascinating going on there about how like the U.S. is like censors itself as a global debtor, and in doing so, it sort of floats a financial order, and like there's the sort of like image or trope of like sort of like multinational finance, like that's sort of interesting. But I don't necessarily understand how that connects to what we were talking about last time with sort of like thinking about how the system can just perpetuate itself forever. Mm-hmm. Like why is the imperial court not worried about the end of the empire? Like why, like, and then this like problem with like Marx not being right about sort of the inevitable contradiction, the inevitable demise that arises with the contradictions or whatever. But like, mm-hmm. How is it that like we can view the U.S. as this sort of like anchor, but then like where does the demise come into play here? Like,
okay, yeah, great. I'll talk. That's good. So I mean, part of what I think is valuable about studying tragedy, studying this history and stuff, is we need to understand how weird it is, how fundamentally world historically weird it is for sovereignty to be the biggest debtor, right? The idea that the sovereign is the most indebted entity in the system is weird. It is bizarre from a historical perspective, because the idea of kingship has always been centered around the idea as the king as being a creditor. The king is who we owe everything to, and the king establishes his power through liberality, right? This has always been part of the discourse of kingship, is the discourse of liberality. The king gives. The king does not owe, right? I mean, the king gives that which he does not owe, and through that gains power, right? That is a very different idea than the king as being the debtor who anchors the entire system of debt, right? I mean, this is why Henry V is deposed, is because he gets too much into debt. I mean, he undermines his sovereignty because he becomes a debtor, and like, but now we have this system in which the sovereign must be a debtor. The sovereign is required to be a debtor. If the sovereign ever stopped trying to be a debtor, then he'd unwind the global financial system because the money is his debt, right? I mean, and that's weird. So this is one thing, right? I mean, just to appreciate how stunningly strange it is that the sovereign is a debtor. That is weird. As far as this question of like of debt crisis, so I could do if I did another seminar, if we had more time with this one, we could study ancient world too, right? So in order to really dig into this question of debt, we kind of would need to study the ancient Mediterranean world. So I'll give you kind of maybe a short version of like what that seminar would be about if we did it, which is sort of that the oldest form of social crisis in urbanized civilization is a debt crisis. And it arises simply from the fact that debt accumulates purely mathematically because you write it down on paper. And so the debt, as long as there's interest-bearing debt, you always have a tendency for it to grow faster than the ability of debtors to service that debt. And in Mesopotamia, this is a problem. Why? Because the king's power depends upon the existence of a free landholding class. So you have a class of like basically free landholders who are your military base. So you need these people to be free and to own some property and stuff in order to serve as your military base. That's where you recruit your soldiers from. And if you allow debt to just keep growing, eventually what happens is it produces social inequality. I mean, debt is always going to increase the Gini coefficient of your society unless you do something about it, simply because it grows arbitrarily and tends to redistribute wealth to the hands of people who control the apparatus of credit. And so what happens is you get all your soldiers and they get into debt, and then they have to sell their land, and eventually they're going to have to sell themselves into slavery, and then they won't be very good soldiers anymore. Slaves do not make good soldiers. Mamluks are aside. Mamluks are an exception and very different, right? But normally, but slaves don't make good soldiers. And so the king has to abolish the debt every once in a while in order to maintain his own power. It's necessary. Now, we in the 20th century are faced with this problem that in comparison to Mesopotamia, we have fantastically complex technologies to price and hedge risk. And we can keep the debt accumulating for seemingly for a very infinitely long period of time, right? So debt can accumulate. The only thing that limits the accumulation of debt is simply the ability of the people who owe the debt to service it. And what is weird is that servicing debt can be done simply by loaning more money into existence, right? I mean, if you owe me $100 and I say, you know, William, where's my $100? And you say, I don't have it, I'm sorry. I say, well, it's okay, I'm merciful. Now you just owe me $110, you know, and next year you come and you say, I'm sorry, I still don't have the $110. I say, okay, that's great, but now it's $121 or whatever, you know, and it keeps going up and up. And as long as I don't need to get money to meet my own debts, it doesn't matter. And in fact, I might prefer for your debt to continue accumulating because it is worth more and more to me the longer you don't pay it, right? So the only question is the extent to which I, as your creditor, becomes subject to the discipline of payments. Okay, so so every time your debt to me comes up for payment, I have a decision to make. Okay, I have an option, which is that I can say, no, I want it now, or I can say, it's okay, pay me later, but you owe me more. I always have this option, and there is nothing that constrains me from rolling this debt over more and more and more, unless I am being subjected to a demand for payment from one of my creditors, right? If one of my creditors is saying, no, I don't want to roll over your debt, I want to get paid now, then I have to go to you and call it my debt, okay? And so this is in the Bible. It's called the parable of the unforgiving servant. It's Matthew something, I forget, right? But the parable is that there's a very rich man and he has his debt forgiven, and then he goes to one of his creditors and he calls in the debt, and for this he's sent to hell and all of this stuff, right? So there is a chain of creditors and debtors, and the only reason that debts ever have to be called in is if they are called in at some point, higher up the chain. We are now in a situation where, in effect, there is no such thing anymore as outside money. Okay, so outside money meaning money that is not created by the extension of credit. So if I loan you, if I say, you take my class and you learn some stuff and now you owe me $100, no, there doesn't have to be any money as long as I just say, okay, yeah, you owe me $100, right? There only has to be real money to the extent that I call in this debt, right? So if I provide you with a service and now you owe me money, we have created money. We've created what's called inside money. We see this in Henry IV 1, when Falstaff has a big tab at the tavern, right? So Falstaff is drinking all of the stuff and he has this tab. He owes money to Dame Quickly. That has actually increased the money supply. There is more money in the world now because Falstaff owes money to Dame Quickly. It's what's called inside money. As we saw in some of our readings, though, you can't do everything with inside money, right? I mean, there are situations in which people won't take inside money. And the most common reason this is because they're a foreigner, okay? So as we're thinking about the way that the role that language plays in this conflict between French and English, right? I mean, there is this, somebody who speaks a different language than you is not part of your credit system, right? I mean, your debt is written in English and their debt is written in French, and it's mutually unintelligible. I mean, it's inside, and it is inside a political, linguistic, cultural system. And so if you're dealing with people who are not part of your credit system, they might demand outside money. Now, the most relevant demand for outside money in our context is suppliers of war material, right? So if I'm a guy and I have a bunch of gunpowder and you're a king and you're like, I'm being invaded, I need to buy this gunpowder, I'm like pretty unlikely to want to sell you this on credit, right? I mean, because like, what if you lose? I mean, I don't want you to owe me, because if you lose and you're no longer the king and my accounts receivable that you owe me is no good. So I said, no, I need gold, right? So kings need to get gold in order to get war supplies. Another big reason that you need hard money is for luxuries that come from China, right? So a lot of gold and silver, mostly silver from Europe, is going to China in exchange for silks, incense, luxury goods. And this is one of the reasons that often you'll see like kings trying to shut down the luxury trade, is because it's bleeding metal to the east. But we live in a world now in which there really is no outside money. So there is no money which is outside of the dollar system. The dollar, the reserve dollars that the Federal Reserve creates, are the outside money of the world. Why? Because the empire has suppressed other forms of outside money, right? So the empire really has actively suppressed the international monetary system. And essentially there is no more international monetary system. There is only the domestic United States monetary system, and there is no money which is outside of that. So there is no money that anyone could demand from you because they don't want to accept dollars. There just isn't, that monetary economy doesn't exist anymore. So, and this is what's at stake when this exchange that I opened my dissertation with, when you may know it, when Ron Paul interrogates Ben Bernanke about whether gold is money. This is in 2009, 2011. I think it's 2011 essentially. So it's when the Federal Reserve is engaging in some of this quantitative easing, second round of quantitative easing, and Ron Paul kind of uses his time in the Senate to interrogate Ben Bernanke about whether gold is money, and Ben Bernanke says no, it's an asset. And Ron Paul says, well, some of us still think it's money, right? So there's this problem about, there's this idea that there is something illegitimate about the United States having suppressed the monetary system, right? But the point is that there is no real way that exists in the world now in which creditors can demand something other than dollars, because it's been suppressed. And so if the demand for outside money is the only thing that can make the credit system collapse, right? If it is the margin call on outside money, it's essentially if I demand that I am no longer accepting inside money to meet my contracts, I only want hard money, I only want gold, that demand is what makes the credit system start to contract. And as long as that demand is off the table, then there's nothing that can force the Federal Reserve to make the financial system collapse. Does that kind of make sense? Like, so it is only the extent to which economically important actors can demand payment in something other than dollars that there could be any limit to the expansion of the dollar leverage. Okay. Now, the point that I'm suggesting is that despite the fact that like there is no outside money, it's kind of impossible for the dollar system to run out, because as long as the Federal Reserve decides to create more dollars, it can continue to allow the system to leverage itself. Now, okay, there's a couple of tensions that might emerge from it doing this, okay? The first is the question of like the extent to which our domestic economy can tolerate more and more and more leverage. Because in a way, there's no real limit to the amount of debt that everybody can take on, except that, as I think probably, you know, a lot of us know from our lived experience, like having debt or being a part of a generation of people who are drowning in debt people use the word crushed under deflation for a reason, because it feels like being crushed. I mean, it feels like, because you can't ever acquire any, you know, all you're doing is just servicing your debt. And so, you know, I mean, as long as they can, you know, but the point is that as long as they just want to keep loaning us more money to become more and more and more in debt, there's no limit to that process, except if the people who are becoming indebted can pose some kind of political challenge to the state, right? I mean, as long as what they want to do is, you know, it gets, you know, coronavirus hits, it gets really bad, and they're like, okay, we'll give you $1,200 to like roll over your debt a little bit, and we say thanks, but we have no power to compel them to give us more than that, right? We don't really have much power to vote for a candidate that we like to be the president. I mean, our ability to contest this is limited, right? And the problem is, you know, so one problem is that unlike maybe in Mesopotamia, our empire has kind of figured out a way to make debt work for the military machine, right? Because what's one of the biggest reasons people join the army? Because they have debt, they want to go to college, not get debt, right? So I mean, the stick of debt capture is something that is now used in order to draw people into the military. And it's also a military that requires far less manpower than like previous military. It's the organic composition of capital of the military sector is very high, right? I mean, you don't really need that many people for our system, right? So I think in a way, like what I would say is that these previous limits to the ability of the empire to indebt all of its citizens have kind of been attenuated, like, because that was one previous reason that they couldn't do this, was because they needed us to fight for them, and we wouldn't do it if they let us go into debt. But that doesn't really seem to be the case anymore, right? It might be the case, you know, I mean, peasant revolts were a much bigger problem in the medieval period than they are now, right? I mean, like, you know, Richard II and his advisors were defeated by a peasant revolt in 1381, and they failed to have, you know, but the idea that we could revolt against the state is now, you know, is a right-wing fantasy, you know, it's an NRA kind of fantasy. I mean, peasant revolts are not really, so like, what is a threat to the state? Doesn't really, right? But so the point here is that the limit of the process is the ability of kind of people to pose a political challenge to the system, rather than any kind of like hard limit that's coded into it, right? So another kind of a problem that is, so as we see in the coronavirus, the problem is that the global supply chain has all of these people in it who are not part of the Federal Reserve System. They're not part of the jurisdiction of the United States. They're outside of our economy, but nevertheless, they use dollars, right? And so coronavirus has really collapsed this global payments chain and has created a liquidity crunch in the global economy. And the problem is that if all of those firms were inside our domestic economy, if they were inside the Federal Reserve System, then the Federal Reserve could print money just to keep them afloat, to keep the debt increasing. But if we're talking about, you know, the Philippines or something like that, we're talking about Philippine exporters, they're not part of the system. And the question is it legitimate or not for the Federal Reserve to incorporate them into the Federal Reserve System in order to save them, right? And so, and this is what has been happening. I mean, and the Federal Reserve has in a way, after 2008, became the world's central banker, but even more so in Corona. I mean, is now the Federal Reserve is now kind of have been forced to backstop this entire global payments chain, which has the effect of drawing the entire global economy further into the empire. Kind of, and the question becomes like, if there's a contradiction, right? If the more the Federal Reserve does this, the more the Federal Reserve tries to protect the value of debts throughout the entire global economy, if the effect of that is to increase the amount of debt and leverage in the domestic economy, right? It crushes the domestic U.S. economy under deflation. We all become more and more indebted. I mean, like, the question is, like, you know, can it go on forever? I mean, must there be a breaking point? I mean, there has always been a breaking point in the past. The history of processes like these, of which there have been many, it always comes to a breaking point. But the question, it's an open question for me, is whether all of the things that might break this process have been taken off the table in the modern period. And if there are no more limits to this, then it seems like, yeah, I mean, I don't know what would make this process stop. It seems like Corona was going to do it for a little bit, but that story's not over yet. And does that address your question, William?
Yeah, I think it, like, it's the other question that I have is the answer to this question is that, like, at the end of the day, like, the debt that gets paid is like a corporeal debt, like the buck stops like when we die. I don't know, like there is no, I mean, this is a question of, like, to what degree is money related to the body? And, like, I think, like, in the high court, like, these sort of, like, optioning one's lineage, there's a certain like Oedipal look at that, but there's also like it's an economic I think that's very interesting. But I think, like, also, like, what keeps the U.S., like, what is this sort of, like, perpetual motion machine that really, this is just my reading, and it has to do with some, like, my own things I've written. It's like, what is this perpetual motion machine? Well, it's just, like, people in the United States dying to uphold, like, the absolute just indebting. Mm-hmm. And, like, at a certain point, there's just an implementation of force and military police to withhold the debts, but then, like, but then we still have to pay, we still have to service the debt. Am I using this right? Like, we still have to
all you have to do is service the debt. That's the thing. I mean, you don't, this is what is a little mind-bending about the whole thing, is that you only have to service the debt. That's the only thing that matters. It doesn't matter whether the debt can really be eventually paid off at all or not. Like, that's irrelevant. Partly because, like, you know, if you die and you're in debt, well, you know, it just means your creditors get to seize your estate and your children don't inherit anything, right? So if we think about, you know, what is the structural function of the medical industry in the United States? Okay, why is the United States have this anomalous healthcare system where we spend 3 times as much money as anybody else per capita, and we have way worse outcomes, right? I mean, like, it is, one could try to explain this in various kinds of ways, but, like, my reading of this is that it's very much connected to the imperial monetary dilemmas that we've been talking about, and that it's intentional, and that the purpose of the medical sector is to prevent intergenerational transfer of wealth by the middle class. I mean, essentially, that's the point. The point is, your parents get sick. Your parents are, you know, however old. My parents are like in their early 70s, I think. I forget exactly, right? I mean, they're getting old. But the point is, you can throw as much money at keeping them alive for a little bit longer. There's no limit to the amount of money that you can throw at that, right? So, like, you know, and you're old. I mean, if there's no limit to the amount of debt that you'd be willing to take on in order to live a little bit longer, because you're going to die anyway. I mean, what does it matter if you're in debt, right? So, I mean, so there's this so I think, like, the structural function of, and the reason that healthcare industry in the United States is, like, so dysfunctional is to prevent assets from being accumulated in inheritance lines of like the broad middle class. I mean, the problem for the United States has been that World War II created this mass affluent white, this mass affluent white class of people, right, who have assets. It's world historically anomalous because the problem is that mobilization of World War II put all of this money into their pockets, and what they do with it, they bought bonds. My grandfather bought bonds in the 50s, and if you bought bonds in the 50s, it's been a bull market in bonds for ever since then. I mean, just goes up and up and up and up. So I mean, you just as a reward for establishing the empire, which is what World War II did, you created this class of people who had assets. I mean, significant amounts of assets. And this is kind of a problem. It was a problem in the 60s, when you graduated, you taught people how to read and they didn't have any debt, and they became hippies and they started protesting the war and stuff. And it was massively socially destabilizing. It is very socially destabilizing to have a large class of people who own assets and don't have any debt and all of this, and so I really see sort of this healthcare thing as a way to destroy that middle class, that socially disruptive large middle class, just basically just by by allowing them to spend arbitrarily large amounts of money on palliative end of life care, basically. So like, yeah, okay. So on the one hand, the debt doesn't have to be paid because getting the debt paid back might not be the purpose of accumulating it. So predatory finance is kind of defined by, if I loan you money because I want to seize your collateral rather than get it paid back, that's predatory, right? So I loan you money and I demand collateral for it, but normally I don't want your collateral, right? I mean, I don't want to repossess your house because then I have to deal with it. I have to sell it and all of this shit. So if I'm loaning you money to buy a house because I want you to default and so I can repossess the house, that's predatory finance. And so there's one element of that. But the other aspect of it is just that the debt doesn't have to be paid back. It only has to be serviced, because the purpose of it is to serve as a vehicle of accumulation, right? So I don't really want you to pay me back. What I want is for you to owe me money so that I can own the money that you owe me as an asset. And as long as we can just keep that asset liquid, and if we can hedge out the risk that you might default on it by by selling insurance on it, right? Basically, so you can owe me money, and if I can buy a credit default swap on the money that you owe me, so this is in 2008, this was a big part of the story, was these credit default swaps, right? So I can buy insurance on you defaulting, and if we can price and spread out the risk of you defaulting on me, it doesn't matter to me whether you pay me back or not, because I've already, if you don't pay me back, then I'll just get to collect my insurance contract and I'll get the asset anyway. And so really what it's about is not about being paid back, but about something that can accumulate forever and be a store of wealth, right? And so in a way, I'm making you into my asset just because I'm using you as a vehicle of debt accumulation, right? And what is interesting is that, that is what happens to the king in the English 18th century, right? So in the English 18th century, we developed the consolidated English debt. There is still today debt that the English crown borrowed in the early 18th century, which it has never paid back and will never pay back. And it does not need to pay it back, right? That is not the point. In fact, if it tried to pay it back, that would be a problem because then there would be less of this debt for people to own, right? The point of the debt is that it is owed and it will never be paid back. It will just be serviced indefinitely. And that's the money. That's money, right? And so, like, in a way, the problem is when we imagine that debt has to be paid back, and that if it isn't paid back, then that's going to be a problem for creditors. But it doesn't. It just has to be serviced. And so as long as we can come up with some way to continue servicing the debt, then you can just sort of kick the can down the road, and you can kick it down the road forever. I mean, the only real problem is if essentially if you repossess so much of everything that nobody can take on any more debt, and then your system can't go on, and that's sort of this point that we're reaching now. But what's difficult about it is that it's like there has to be a limit, but there is no particular limit. I mean, there is no particular point at which we can be like, yeah, it can't go on further anymore. I mean, but it also seems impossible to imagine that you could just create more and more in debt infinitely. I mean, at what point does the suspension of disbelief that we have that the debt will one day be paid, at what point does that break? I mean, but what I kind of want to suggest to you is it's a narrative problem. It's a problem about narrative. It's not a problem about metaphysics or a problem about the substance of value or something like this. It's a question of the narrative, and so this is why thinking about like militarism and jingoism are important, right? I mean, Henry V is able to balance his budget because he has a good narrative, and he's able to get people to want to contribute to the state through taxation in order to support the war against the French, and so really, so if we think about like the stability of legitimizing narratives as being the breaking point of the monetary system, instead of like an imbalance or something like it, it changes the way we think about the problem. But the real issue is that a system of political economy that is built upon accumulating assets by indebting people and then rolling over that debt forever is a society which is based upon the accumulation of wealth and people. Right? I mean, slavery, chattel slavery is one kind of wealth and people. The accumulation of odious debt is another kind of wealth and people. And if we begin to sort of think about recent United States political economy as being the transition to a political economy that's based around wealth and people rather than accumulation of industrial capital, it's no longer subject to this sort of theory of capitalism. I mean, it's not capitalism. If what I'm trying to do is not accumulate machines to make more stuff cheaper with less labor, I mean, that's not what the political economy is about. It's about getting you in debt and hedging the debt so that I don't care if you default, and we distribute the risk. And because we never really know exactly when anybody's going to die, it doesn't matter if you die and don't pay your debt because I've already hedged it. But if you look at the history of conflicts like this, what always has to happen eventually is that there has to be a write down of some kind, right? You have to rebalance the real economy with financial accumulation through inflation, through bankruptcy, all this kind of stuff. But what we've been doing is taking all those options off the table. It's really hard to discharge your student debt in bankruptcy. I mean, and the political class is refusing to write down debt through inflation, right? I mean, this $1,200 check was a little bit of that, right? That is a little bit of writing down the debt through inflation. But it's totally inadequate, right? I mean, so yeah. Anybody else want to jump in?
Yeah, I have a question, kind of a comment, but I thought, so I don't know, kind of thinking about this idea of like debt as like a functionalist kind of way in which to like enact statecraft, and like I don't know, I've just been thinking like there was something that we read in the past session which was talking about how the Christian doctrine of usury started to be like relaxed, and I started to think about that in relation to like maybe like the Muslim world where like usury is still like not allowed, and like this idea of like debt as like kind of this like autopoietic drive to extend like the realm and to like what this theme we've talked about in so like when Henry IV, Henry IV then like resolved some of the internal like conflicts in that society by like pushing outwards, and then like and then like so you have Christendom as like the center of imperialist conquest rather than like the Muslim world, because maybe like to sort of settle these really unstable like drives within the society between different people, the debtors and creditors, there's now like this expansion outwards which needs to be satisfied. Like, is that like something that, like, I don't know, and then so it sort of creates this like drive towards growth and like conquest and things.
Yeah. And I mean, the reason for this is that warfare, paying people to kill people, is legitimate. Like, it's okay if we pay money to people for them to go be soldiers. Like, that's okay. In a way that is like illegitimate for us to give people money for other reasons, right? So in a way, like, yeah, we need a war so that we can have an excuse for paying people, because we need to put people's money into people's pockets so that they can service their debt. But if we just say that that's why we're doing it, if we just say there's too much debt in this society, you know, people owe too much money, so we're gonna give them money so that they can pay their debts. Now the question becomes, well, why do we have debt at all? I mean, why don't we just get rid of all the debt? I mean, why do we have debt? Why don't we? And so acknowledging that is the issue, and then addressing it directly threatens to blow up the entire social order. Because if the king can do that, then why doesn't he? I mean, where we're led is then to the realization that social inequality is upheld by the sovereign just because they like social inequality, and they could get rid of it, but they don't. I mean, but if we have a war, then that gives us an excuse, right? I mean, so, you know, I'll say something about Islamic finance in just a second, because there's something important here. But like, if we think about, like, you know, I've been with the quarantine and everything, right? People have made the point, look, being told to quarantine is the same thing as being drafted into military service. I mean, the state is demanding that you sacrifice your life, that you, in a way, in order to serve the strategic needs of the state. It wants you to stay home. And what's the difference between that and being drafted into the military? So we should be paid to do that, right? There's this idea that, you know, we could extend the definition or the conception of what it means to be in the military to all sorts of other things, right? I mean, there's, like, you know, think about, like, you know, if you think about like a Marxist or whatever who writes some kind of screed against MMT or whatever, you know, oh, if we start printing money, you know, it'll be inflation. This is not really the way to do class struggle or whatever. And you just wonder, why don't they have this kind of like scandalized view of like paying people to be in the military? I mean, we pay people as soldiers to do lots of useless stuff. I mean, soldiers often just sort of sit around doing nothing. I mean, and that's fine. I mean, that doesn't raise this, like, that doesn't send anybody into hysterics about the metaphysics of value or anything. It doesn't scandalize anybody. Like, why? I mean, yeah, people might complain like, oh, we spend too much, you know, this amount of money spent on bombs could have been this other thing. I mean, you get that kind of discourse, but you don't get this idea that funding the military breaks reality in this way, that we do get that in the idea that we might do other things, right? But the fact is that soldiers don't have to do anything useful. Soldiers don't have to justify the money that we spend on them. It's just a way to spend money, right? And so in a way, the military, rather than money being something that we need in order to run the military is kind of something that we need in order to have an excuse for spending money. And as you know, I mean, the American military is a make-work project for Rust Belt white America. I mean, that's what it does. That's what it's for. It's an excuse to spend money. But again, you know, precisely the problem is that we can't, even if, you know, we need the military as an excuse to spend money, we can't give up this narrative that the military is why we're spending the money. Because if we give it up, then we can say, well, we just need to spend money because we need to spend money, and then we can spend it on anything that we want. We can spend it on the pursuit of justice, and that would destroy society, right? I mean, so that's why the military is this very convenient means of dealing with a internal creditor-debtor crisis, simply because it gives you an excuse to spend money, and it gives you a narrative that explains why it's necessary to spend money. And so, you know, and so there we kind of have a question like, okay, you know, what's a better strategy? You know, should we say, we need to spend money because climate change is going to kill us if we don't. Like, can we harness the energy of militaristic narratives in order to have a war on climate change? Or is the solution to say, well, actually the good thing is that we need to spend money in order to have the economy grow, and climate change gives us an excuse to do that. I mean, which those are two kind of different options for the way that you think about it. So there's some of my comments on that, but I do want to say one thing about Islamic finance and usury. So as we saw last time, the prohibition on usury was really a prohibition against the creation of inside money, right? That's really what it is. So we've been talking about the way that banks can loan money into existence. The prohibition on usury in reference to the bills of exchange was kind of to say, look, you can use these bills of exchange in order to transfer money easily, but don't create any money using this, because there's this threat that we can use the bills of exchange to actually create money rather than simply move it from one place to another. And that's what usury is designed to prevent. The Islamic discourse on finance is a little bit different, and it's interesting because essentially the prohibition of what's called riba in Islam, R-I-B-A, is a prohibition against essentially debt. It actually is a prohibition against debt, because the idea is that all partners in a contract should be risk-bearing. So the problem with debt is that if I own debt as an asset, then I am not exposed to any risk, right? The only risk that I'm exposed to is counterparty risk. I'm exposed to the risk that you might default and not pay me. But if I loan you money in order to go, get a ship and fill it with oil and sell it someplace else, I am not exposed to the risk of like your project succeeding or failing or whatever. You owe me the same amount of money no matter what. The prohibition of riba in Islam is essentially saying you can't do that. That if I loan you money in order to do some kind of project, I have to bear risk. I have to have equity rather than debt, right? So this is the difference between equity and debt, is that if I own debt, I don't have any risk. If I own equity, then I own a share in your project. And so I'm actually, I'm invested in your success, right? This is the problem, is whether the relations of credit that exist between you and me, does it make me invested in your success, or rather does it make me invested in your failure? And that is what prohibitions about finance often involve, is the attempt to get rid of the kind of bad debt in which I become invested in your failure, right? So if I am lending you money because I want to own your debt as an asset, I don't really want you to succeed, because maybe I want you to be unable to pay me, right? I mean, if you owe me $100 and you come and you pay me my $100, well, now I have to find something else to do with my $100, right? I need to I now have what's called reinvestment risk. So I have to go find something else. But if you can't pay me, now my money's invested. I'm earning a return on it. I'm earning interest, right? So that might actually make me invested in your failure, which would turn debt from a kind of a positive sum game into a negative or zero sum game. So I think this is a major issue with student debt. I mean, I think the case to be made is that, well, okay. I mean, so let's think about this. So I mean, one suggestion that has kind of been floated by various people for student debt is a debt equity swap. I don't know if y'all have kind of heard about this, right? But this idea would be basically the argument boils down to we need equity financing for students rather than debt financing, because the whole problem is the university doesn't give a shit whether its students succeed or not, really. I mean, they owe the same amount of money anyway. So we can see the university as a debt-producing institution is kind of being invested in the failure of its students. I'm about to go on the job market, so I feel this very, very personally. And so the argument has been floated, right? Okay, so we need to have equity investments for students, right? So instead of having a set interest rate, we're going to take some percentage of your earnings, for some period of time in your life or whatever, right? So what would this do? Well, it would make the holders of student debt invested in your success, because if you can't get a job, then the percentage of your income that they're going to harvest is going to be lower. But I think generally by kind of progressives and people on the left, these kinds of suggestions have been met with skepticism. Like it almost seems worse and it's sort of the idea is like, oh, you're selling yourself into indentured servitude in order, we feel squeamish about this idea of equity financing of the investment in education. But from another perspective, it's good and Islamic because it trades debt for equity, and equity is good because it makes us all on the same side, right? So there's a couple of thinking about like, in order to really think about imperialism today, we would have to think about the oil system. I don't know if we really have time to get into that. The book I would recommend to read if you haven't read it is called Timothy Mitchell. It's by Timothy Mitchell. It's called Carbon Democracy. If we're trying to think about this, recent oil crash and everything. And kind of like long story short, if there is any outside money in the world today, it's oil. If there is anything which is outside of the dollar that is really money more than dollars are money, it's oil. And I would suggest that we can probably understand like post-World War II imperialism as the desire of the empire to control all of the oil production so that it can control the price of money. And essentially the problem being that if oil is really the most valuable thing in the world economy, and kind of like precious metals, it's like it's fairly high value, kind of easy to transport, and so it's really the money. The problem is that oil is basically worthless because it's very cheap to pump out of the ground, and if there were a free market in oil, it would cost nothing. And so really sort of the goal of the empire is to control the sites of oil production so that it can keep the oil in the ground in order to raise the price of oil. So the empire both at once squanders oil to increase demand for it. So this is what we've seen after Corona, is that the ability of the United States in particular, but the global north in general, to be structural squanderers of oil in order to keep the price up has collapsed. And so the price of oil collapses. And also if you can control production and you can keep the oil in the ground, then you can try to raise the price of oil artificially in order to be the basis of the monetary system. To give you kind of an analogy, in the 5th century BC, Persia was trying to seize all of the gold and silver mines in the known world. So essentially, Persia had this monetary system, gold and silver, because Athens had a silver mine, they were able to arbitrage the Persian currency peg. So really long story short, Persia is committed to maintaining a parity between gold and silver. If you have the silver mine in Athens, you can ship silver to Athens and ship silver from Athens to Persia and gold from Persia to Athens, and you make a profit on the round trip. You arbitrage their currency peg, and the Persians didn't like this, and that's why this is kind of a controversial thesis about the Persian War, but I think this is a major thing lying behind the Persian War. Right? So essentially the Persians, there were 3 mines they didn't control in all of the known world, and their foreign policy was about trying to control the mines so that they could keep anybody else from mining it and using that as outside money on their system, right? If that kind of makes sense. So I think that oil geopolitics are really very much about the control over the monetary system. I don't know that this seminar gave us all the tools that we need to really understand that, but I can tantalize you with that a little bit, I guess. Yeah. James, did that kind of address your question? You have it?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I think it's kind of one of those questions that is so big that I don't know if, yeah. Yes.
But I guess I would say I think that the debt equity swap thing is worth thinking about. Like it is, I mean, it's less good from a radical politics perspective than just like abolish all the debt. I mean, that's good too, right? But in the absence of the political possibility to abolish the debt, swapping debt for equity is potentially a powerful gesture because it makes an appeal to fairness, right? I mean, it is fundamentally unfair that my creditors don't care whether I succeed or fail, and that in fact they might be invested in my failure. And there's a political question about, like, can we make the incentives align, right? So to return to Henry V, right? I mean, this is sort of, at least retrospectively, looking back on Henry V, people feel that he was able to do this somehow, right? Henry V could make everybody's interests align in society such that he could balance the budget and everybody was happy to give him the money, right? And he, like, and this idea that, like, if you can make all the incentives align correctly, then we could create a world in which there were no zero-sum monetary decisions that had to be made, right? I mean, this is the problem, is that the inherent instability of the monetary system. So I've been trying to suggest to you that both dynasty and the monetary system are inherently unstable, and they're inherently unstable in isomorphic or homologous ways. And the problem is that this instability produces the necessity for somebody or something to intervene and to make a zero-sum decision, right? Somebody loses, somebody wins, and if we don't make that decision, the whole thing is going to collapse. And that is what is scandalous about monetary sovereignty, is the idea that it is going to arbitrarily intervene in order to make some people win and some people lose. And confronted with that problem, we might try to imagine a political order in which all of the incentives are aligned and in which there are no zero-sum. There is no necessity for anybody ever to make any zero-sum decisions through the impetus of monetary sovereignty, right? And the liberal view, which is sort of the common sense of our society, is sort of to say, like, that's how things naturally are until sovereignty gets involved, right? I mean, there's this idea that money is kind of naturally fair and purely horizontal, and it's consensual. And the problem is that, like, when the state gets involved, then it makes things unfair. And what I'm kind of trying to suggest is that, I mean, the state ends up having to get involved because of the natural inherent instability of the monetary system. And this is sort of the problem of kingship, is that if you don't do anything, then all of society falls apart. And if you do something, then you're going to piss off some faction of your society. And the question is, and then you're faced with basically just the question of, well, okay, I guess I'll just choose to piss off the least powerful part of society. And the question is, if that keeps happening, do you throw your society into crisis? I mean, your society has to renegotiate that. The question is whether it calls into legitimacy your power to do those things, right? I mean, this is what Obama did, right? I mean, Obama is faced with the problem. I have to piss somebody off. The monetary system is collapsing, and I must make a decision. Who am I going to piss off? Well, I'm going to piss off the least powerful people in society, right? Because they're the ones who lack the power to fight back. Yeah, and so I think it's an interesting question to meditate and to think about whether we believe in this possibility of a society in which all of the interests coincide. I mean, that would be the optimistic view, is that, yes, we could solve the problem such that everybody's interests, there are no zero-sum monetary decisions to be made. The sort of pessimistic, sort of Schmittian view would be to say, yeah, I mean, it's inevitable. There's no way out of this problem, and we just sort of have to take it seriously for what it is, which is the problem that MMT wants to avoid. Right? I mean, MMT wants to avoid this problem. They want to say economic growth is what everybody wants. If everybody, nobody would complain. Everybody's interest is the same in terms of wanting economic growth. And the problem is that we don't understand how money works. And if we understood how money works, then we would do this thing, we could have growth, and everybody would like that. The question becomes whether, the reason that we don't do that is because not doing it is benefiting people. Who is it benefiting? Well, it's benefiting all the people who hold this debt that we owe them. And then the question becomes, is it possible to piss those people off? And how would you do that? I mean, if what you want to do is to make a decision in which those people lose, is it possible? Would the empire survive that? I don't know. I mean, if Bernie Sanders had won the election and started printing money in order to give everybody free college, I mean, would that mean that the United States Treasury Bond was no longer going to be the money of the world because the Saudis and all these other people who are holding all these assets decide that it's not safe anymore? We don't trust the king. The king has rediscovered how to be a king and is deciding to do things through their power, and what does that do? I mean, it collapses the impotence of the sovereign that we depend upon to defend our debt. I mean, I don't know the answers to those questions, but those are the questions. Any?
I have.
Yeah.
I have one observation. Something that you were talking about earlier about narrative stuck out to me. The military is something that we need as an excuse to spend money, and even if we don't need it, we can't give up this narrative. And I was thinking about how most Americans could not, at least on a cursory level, see the relationship between presidencies and kingships through inheritance. And I bet this is seen as like antithetical to democracy, to elections. Considering the narrative role of the American myth of the self-made man, which Americans value, they've been taught to value wealth. Maybe it's a convenient myth to explain away the austerity politics common to like imperialist or non-representational forms of governance. Self-made myth explains things like Trump favoritism when they say that, oh, he came from outside of governmental politics. And a lot of Americans didn't like Bernie Sanders like talking bad about wealthy people because most Americans aspire to be wealthy. Also, yeah, I don't know if there's a question there, but I guess I keep asking myself, why does Congress think they can solve coronavirus crisis with the bank?
Yeah. Right. So the idea of like, right. So I think what you're pointing to is that there is a legitimation narrative that underpins legitimacy of the United States government, which is that essentially like the US will never take away the option to become rich, right? What matters is not me actually being rich, but the fact that I possess the option to be rich, and that this, even if this option is out of the money, if I can't actually exercise it, at least I have it, right? I mean, at least the social order recognizes my potential wealthiness, and it does not foreclose this possibility, even if I don't actually. And in a way, that's more valuable to me than like what I could get from a government handout, right? And so like the opposition to redistributive policies is I think, as you have identified, is not a rational. There's no rational actor here calculating what their expected value is for different things, right? I mean, if they did that, they would say, well, obviously I'm gonna be better off under socialism. And so what's really being threatened? Well, it's the legitimation narrative, which is that I could become wealthy. And if you criticize people who did become wealthy, you're taking that away from me. And, and if you just give money to people who don't deserve it, because you can, then you're undermining, you're taking that away from me. You're undermining, you're threatening the option that I own on my own success in the future, even if it's just an option. I think that like, in a way, this might be the hardest problem of monetary politics for us. And I think maybe it has something to do with the problem that if we begin like redistributing wealth because we think it's good, we now have to answer a question about like what the good life is that we could avoid by not doing that. I mean, because in a way, the legitimation narrative not only says you can become rich if you work hard and you deserve it, it also says that when you're rich, there is no limit to what you can enjoy. And like, not only is there no limit to like what you should be allowed to spend your money on, but there is no limit to the new kinds of enjoyment that will be produced in the future, right? So the legitimation narrative very much has to do with the idea that the progress of the economy into the future generates with it like new forms of enjoyment that we don't have yet. And so the idea is that if you believe that scarcity is what motivates innovation, and that innovation is what brings us new untold kinds of enjoyment in the future, the problem is that if you start trying to realize justice in the present, you're going to kill the goose that lays the golden eggs, right? Because you're going to undermine the conditions of scarcity that like spur innovation, right? And so I think there's that to it also, which is that if we say, that's not, if we give up this idea that the future holds unlimited and ever increasing enjoyment, and that this enjoyment is produced by greed, right? So it is my personal greed that underpins the engine that produces enjoyment in the future. Like, not only are you telling me like what I need in my life and what really matters and what is frivolous and like what is real, and you're telling me that there's like some kind of limit to how wealthy people can be. And so this is like a problem. It's a problem for climate change as well as this is inequality, right? I mean, I hope you kind of see where I'm going with that, right? I mean, it's sort of like what I own is not only, okay, so I think if we think about it this way, we can make these people a little bit more rational than they are generally presented as being, right? Because the typical way this is presented is like, oh, stupid hicks, like they think they're going to be millionaires. You're never going to be a millionaire. Obviously, that's wrong. Okay, but if I see what they are valuing and possessing as this out of the money option on wealth, the problem is that option might come into the money in the future if capitalism keeps going, right? I mean, because if I think that competition and the need to get money and the need to work and all this stuff drives innovation and makes the whole world richer, if that keeps going, then eventually my option will come into the money. I mean, eventually it'll work, right? I mean, so you kind of have to add that to it. I mean, you have to add this faith in the open-endedness of the future and the idea of like the continual progression of the future. And it kind of makes that belief like a little bit more rational. And then it sort of like tells you like, why is it such a deep problem? I mean, it's because you have to tell people like what's good in life. I mean, what do you really need in order to be happy? And the legitimacy narrative of the United States says we cannot, and we are not allowed to tell you what you need to be happy, because that is your sovereign right as an individual, right? Your life, your liberty, and your pursuit of happiness, which, as we know, is a euphemism for the pursuit of property, is your fundamental right. I mean, and so that's like, not all societies are like that, right? I mean, some societies do have a power to sort of tell you what matters and like what you don't need and what you do need, but we don't have the cultural resources to do that, and that may be like a really deep problem.
So do you think maybe like these like hicks are like really deep modernists? They're really deep like modernists, and they think like just like the improvement of society as a fundamental like value.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, so in a way, you can kind of think about it like, once we understand that the modern monetary system is based upon debt that will never be paid back and never intends to be paid back, right? Okay, why is it worth something? Well, it's worth something because the present value of that debt can increase, and it kind of only works as long as you think that things will just keep getting better in the future. So sort of like maybe what we're faced with now is the problem that we still have this system based upon debt that will never be paid back, but what we've lost is the condition of the narrative condition of believing in that, which is that if things get better and better forever, then it doesn't matter if the debt gets paid off. But if now we're saying like, oh, actually things are going to get worse, like future generations will be poorer than the past, and the debt will never be paid back, like those are kind of incompatible in a way that the other two things weren't, right? And so yeah, so I mean, maybe this is I haven't thought about this exactly before until y'all just said this, you know, but like maybe there's a deep connection there between like a debt-based monetary system and the belief in growth, in economic growth. And so yes, I mean, they are modernists in this sense. And that like the problem is that if we say growth party's over, like we no longer care about unlimited potential for enjoyment in the future, what we care about is like holding on to what we have. Does that call the entire constitution of the modern monetary system fundamentally into question, right? I mean, like if this constitution, because if the debt is at 0% forever, right? I mean, in order for this perpetual floating debt thing to be possible, it seems like it kind of needs to pay interest. I mean, why else would you own debt that you knew is never going to get paid back unless you're being paid something for holding it? Well, if interest rates go to 0%, nobody's making any interest. Is it even possible? I mean, this is I think what is kind of has been blowing my mind and a lot of other people's mind is like if 2008 ushered in this era of like zero interest rates, and if what sort of the powers that be have been trying to do is to ward off that, they've been trying as hard as they can to prevent zero interest rates. I mean, if we live in a world now in which like, you know, in which this long-term debt goes to zero or even below zero and stays there, like this I think, which is an open question, is like, is that possible? Can that be a new foundation for a new kind of monetary order, or is it just impossible and that means it's going to collapse? And my view of that changes on how I feel when I wake up in the morning, I think. But that is, I think, a deep question. Like whether that's possible. Is it possible for zero interest rate perpetual debt to be the foundation for it? And then like if we do enter into a new period of history, of monetary history, in which that is the foundation of the monetary order, does it require a different kind of legitimating narrative, right? And I hope, you know, if you take away only one thing from this huge set of stuff that I've thrown at you over these four sessions, is like, in order for the legitimation narrative that makes the modern monetary order possible, in order to like establish that narrative, the English had to fight a civil war. I mean, they had to destroy their country and reconstitute it in order to make this narrative possible. And so like, if we're contemplating the idea that this legitimation narrative that has been in place for the modern period, if it's kind of falling apart, like, you know, what kind of conflicts would accompany the, you know, what kind of conflicts would usher in this new narrative that has to exist if it's going to be sustained? You know, I mean, there's some people who say things like, you know, so you can observe, if you look at the entire history of finance over 3,000 years, there is a constant tendency for interest rates to decline. I mean, they start at a like really, really high in Mesopotamia. Over history, they go down, 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 down. And some people say what we're living through now is just the end of that. I mean, it's just, there is this 3,000 year long like history of interest rates to fall. And we've now just hit the part in history where the interest rates go below 0%. And that it's just going to, I mean, that to me is weird, because like what it raises in my mind is like, should we expect an asymptote? Like, should I expect it to go further and stay above, you know, asymptotically approach the zero bound? Or if we think this is a trend, like, would it go to zero? I mean, below zero? The idea of negative interest rates is bizarre, but I couldn't rule out the possibility that what we're going to see in the next 100 years of monetary history is a new monetary order based around negative interest rates. And it's interesting. I mean, but I hope, you know, I hope you kind of appreciate how strange that is, you know, but maybe that's the answer. I mean, maybe that's the answer. If we say, look, the modern period was all about thinking that enjoyment would increase arbitrarily in the future, and that's over, and all we care about now is holding on to what we have. I mean, you know, we have something, and the only question is how much of this can we hold on to, because we are in danger of losing all of it. And maybe that is the narrative that legitimizes a negative interest rate regime. I mean, because it says, yeah, you wanna hold debt. Well, I mean, it's dwindling like everybody else's. You know, this thing that you're dwindling is dwindling in the same way that everything else is. And so now you have an interest to help everything not dwindle. Whereas in the situation that we're in now, I mean, the interests are opposites in that, you know, what the interests of people who own debt and who want their debt to continue gaining in value, those are the people who are preventing us from fighting climate change. So I mean, maybe there's an answer lurking there somehow, if we could say, yes, negative interest rates, this is the new regime, and here I will legitimize it, right? But I mean, what story is required to make that work? That's the question. Well, we have like 10 minutes. Yeah, James.
Would like negative interest rates, like, would that like in effect be a system like of degrowth, or would that just sort of perpetuate like a status, like
yeah.
like in terms of degrowth economics?
It's a big can of worms. I don't know if we probably don't have time to like get into it. The short answer is that growth is not really a well-defined concept, for a couple of reasons. One is kind of what we've been talking about, which is that we lack the ability to think about a normative framework about what is good in life, right? So the way that we think about economics is an agnosticism about the good. It says we don't know what the good is, and what it says basically is that everything that happens in the economy is good by definition. This is the result of our agnosticism. But the problem is that it's not actually possible to compute real growth figures if you are normatively agnostic about what the good is. It's impossible, because you can't construct an inflation index if you don't do that. So there's things, you know, so like, how do you say how the value of a dollar has changed over the last 100 years? It's actually like wildly impossible to even begin to make that comparison, because the consumption basket has changed so much. So in order to make an inflation index across any significant period of time for the 20th century, you have to construct all of these consumption baskets and stitch them all together. And constructing a consumption basket requires making normative claims. Like, you know, do you need a car? Do you need a television? Yes or no? I mean, depending on how you answer that question is going to change what the rate of inflation is. If I say televisions aren't necessary, the rate of inflation is different than if I say that they are, right? And in the way that they actually compute these statistics, like the quality of the television matters, right? So how do I say if I buy $1,000 worth of television today versus $1,000 worth of television in 1950? Well, we're talking about radically different televisions. So how do we compare those things? So that's one issue with the category of growth. The other issue is the finance problem. So basically, do we count financial growth as growth or not? And it used to be that the answer was no, and now we do. So most of the growth in the global North economies since the late 70s has been purely in finance. And they have kind of tricky ways of defining this as productive, which are crucially they rely upon the idea of the risk-free rate. So because we have the idea of the riskless asset, which is produced by this history that we've been studying, it is possible to define finance as productive. But I think it's beyond the scope of the time we have remaining to go through the details of that. I can send you, if you email me, I can send you the readings where you can read about all of this. So I would say my position is growth agnostic. I'm a little bit, I don't like the degrowth people, all of that. I think that there's a problem with their discourse because it is predicated on the idea that we have to give something up, right? That like, they kind of they assume that like growth is real and growth is what we want, and growth destroys the world. And so therefore, in order to save the world, we have to give up what we want, which is a kind of a problematic legitimization narrative, right? I mean, like it's hard to imagine the idea of like you have to give up what you want as the foundation of a social order. My alternative strategy for thinking about this is basically to say that, like, first of all, growth is not really all that great for us. Like, we're not necessarily enjoying all of this growth, like, because, I mean, is sitting in traffic good for you? I mean, think about how much more of our lives people spend sitting in traffic today. But that's not counted in the growth figures. I mean, that is growth. I mean, the more we spend on cars and the more we spend on, the more we spend cleaning up people's dead bodies off of the highway, the more growth that, like, traffic accidents are growth. And so it's not clear that, like, we really do want growth or that we're really enjoying growth. And so therefore we don't necessarily have to give up what we want in order to, but sort of the deeper problem is that a lot of what we call growth is just our indebtedness. I mean, if you can indebt the population, accumulate all of this, you count it as growth, then I really don't have to be sad about giving up growth, because the only thing that I'm giving up if I give up growth is my own is my own indebtedness, right? So my strategy, I would say no, it's not necessarily degrowth. I mean, first of all, because you could have zero negative interest rates, and, like, if the price of the bonds is still rising, which those, I mean, negative interest rates going down means the price of the bond going up. So if interest rates go negative, bondholders are getting capital gains. So it's not necessarily not growth. But the deeper thing is that, like, we get distracted by reifying abstract categories like growth and believing that they really exist, when our problem is not really growth. Our problem is carbon. Like, the problem is we need less carbon in the atmosphere. And, like, when you realize that there isn't a direct correspondence between, like, what we count as growth and energetic or metabolic processes in nature, like, there is no direct connection between those things. Like, growth is not really our problem. Just carbon is our problem. And what I would suggest is that, like, if we started really looking at, like, who uses all the carbon, what's really happening is not that we're burning carbon in order to supply, like, stuff that really matters to most people. What's happening is that the rich are transferring money to themselves through financialization, and then they squander this money on burning carbon. So, like, so one way we can think about it is that it's an empirical result that your carbon footprint scales linearly with your income. So the more money you make, the more carbon you burn infinitely. It doesn't matter. So, like, Jeff Bezos is 1 million times richer than me. He burns 1 million times more carbon. Like, that's how it works. But if you think about what's the marginal, to use neoclassical framework, like, what's the marginal utility of income? Well, it's decreasing. So what that means is that, like, $100 windfall to a poor person is worth a lot more than $100 windfall to a rich person. So, like, basically every increment of additional income that you get makes you burn more carbon linearly, but it makes you happier diminishingly, if you see what I mean. So, like, so we have a non-optimal allocation of carbon for happiness, right? And so if you could develop a kind of utilitarian economic framework which would make this argument and say, basically, that, the problem is that rich people are burning all this carbon in order to make themselves a tiny bit more happy, and it would be a lot more efficient if we, if we want to start cutting the carbon budget, we need to cut that first, right? But once we say that, now it gets into this legitimation narrative problem that Nikki raised, right? I mean, if we say, like, everybody deserves this much carbon to have, to do these things, to get them a diet of this kind, and, like, this much living space, and this amount of travel allowance, or whatever, you are cutting out the possibility that my option to be fabulously rich. I mean, you say there's no possibility that this option will one day come into the money, and if that's more important to me than what my life is actually like, then it might be a serious political issue. Yeah. But yeah, so that's a short version of the reason I would say that I think growth is a little bit of the category of growth is a little bit of a red herring.
Well, can I ask, I know we're running out of time, but so I was actually about to ask the same question, but and I'm like less familiar with the kind of like contemporary like rhetoric of like degrowth, like you would like encounter in a political article or something like that. But I found this book on Nicholas Georgescu Rogan.
Yeah. Right.
Like the bioeconomics.
Yep.
Like my question is sort of like just disjointed, but like I do feel like there's something about like a bioeconomic standpoint, and I don't know much about it, but like it's maybe the question of value that you're talking about. Like if we consider measurement of things, it's sort of like the outside money or something like that. Like, but I feel like that sort of relates somehow to the second point, which is like one, things like there's this rhetoric and it feels like very early childhood, like things are getting better and better. You know, it's like I remember playing with toys and be like, someday these could be alive. Right. And they're not, they're going to be dead like everyone else. But like, you know, everything is getting better and better. And then, so like the throne is getting better and better. And then the other one, which is a great one, is I don't want to give up my option on the throne, because I feel like we all in America feel like we have this option on the throne, and you don't want to give up the option on the throne because the throne is getting better and better.
Yeah.
But like,
yes.
But like a degrowth perspective is taking your option, is giving up your option on the throne. And like, and this is stuff that I've seen you say, like, so this gets to like Benjamin Bratton, who's like very anti-degrowth, and he's very much like, we need to invest our time in like architecture firms, and like we need to use like, you know, all this like data mining to like do like surveillance on carbon flows and stuff like this. But like that doesn't really have much to do at all in like the practice of a life with things that I've heard you talk about, which is like building kinship networks. And that to me is like a mode of degrowth. So like, I guess it's like, I guess my question is just about outside money. And this is why like Bitcoin was so tantalizing, I think, because you can make your own money. Like in terms of like kinship networks, if we don't necessarily trust this sort of techno-optimist approach that people like Bratton herald, like are these kinship models, in terms of like a model of resistance, is this a way of, can we make money? Like you said something about inside money or something, like.
Yeah, I mean, we can make, so I mean, you know, we had a question, we talked in the very first session about the question of like municipal finance in Detroit and stuff like this. I mean, yes, I mean, cities can issue money. I mean, there's nothing really actually stopping Detroit from just issuing its own money and saying like, this is, you know, this is the problem is just the extent to which people that Detroit needs to transact with will or will not accept the money that they print. I mean, the question is just what motivates the acceptance. So there's nothing really, there's no like ontological reason that we can't print money, or that you know. So I mean, like cities did this during the Depression. There is a history of this, of municipalities printing their own money during the Depression in order to stimulate their local economies, despite the fact that the federal government is not doing it and all this stuff. But the problem is you just need to not be subject to anybody's power to make you pay outside money. So yeah, you as long as you don't need to buy anything that you can't buy for your own money, you don't need any other kind of money. It's just that, you know, that's a hard situation to get to, where you're not under the power of anybody else to demand that you pay outside money. So like with Bitcoin, I mean, the fantasy of Bitcoin is that you would have a kind of money which was both at once pure inside money and pure outside money is at the same time, right? So Bitcoin is nothing but a ledger. which makes it inside money in that sense, because it is nothing but the recording of a debt. It's a ledger, but it also, because it has this sort of hard-coded scarcity, it's like pure outside money. So Bitcoin is about this fantasy of resolving the contradiction between inside and outside money, such that like there's this idea that like pure outside money could be generated spontaneously through the consensus of the community and all of this kind of stuff. The problem is, okay, so I'm glad you brought this up at the end, because I can motivate a little bit more my suggestion to you that dynasty and money are homologous, because Bitcoin illustrates this exactly, which is that there are succession crises in the blockchain. The problem is you have the blockchain and something, you get a new fork of the coin or something like this, or you get some sort of problem with it. And what ends up happening, you have to get a bunch of people into a room to do politics and decide what's next, right? I mean, so it works fine as long as there's not a succession crisis, but as soon as there's a succession crisis, now sovereignty enters into the question, right? Is who's empowered to decide about the future of the chain, right? And which fork is going to become the ruling fork. So in some of my writing about succession, right, I mean, I analyze these, so we could think about the English anarchy as a fork, right? I mean, there's one fork that goes through Stephen of Blois, and there's another fork that goes through Matilda, and there's just a war over which fork is the real fork. And so like any king list that you actually find is going to have to cut out these forks that could have been, right? There's always, this is what I'm saying about sort of the way that the dynasty produces options, right? I mean, there's always these, the dynasty is always escaping from itself, and there's options being produced, and then the options have to be collapsed in some way. And it generates political conflict. So, Bitcoin is this fantasy about getting out of the politics of money. We're going to remove money from politics by making it totally autonomous. This is a gesture that dates back to the Deuteronomy. In a way, the Hebrew Jubilee is a similar kind of idea, essentially. So the idea of the Jubilee is that we're going to tie the debt right down to the liturgical calendar. So essentially, so God decides when the debt is abolished through the calendar rather than the king. Anyway, there's a genealogy of Bitcoin to Deuteronomy. But the important point is that it's this fantasy about trying to get politics out of the money. But what it shows us is that it reproduces this problem of politics, and it seems to be inescapable. And it really, I mean, and if you tried to make an economy run on Bitcoin, you would figure this out very quickly, because you can't have an economy based on a hard deflationary monetary. So I mean, you couldn't loan Bitcoin. Like who in their right mind would want to accept a loan in Bitcoin? Because if Bitcoin is increasing in value, then your loan is just gonna, the interest, I mean, you'd have to have highly negative interest rates for a Bitcoin loan. Otherwise, it'd be impossible. So anyway, one more note I want to, so you brought up the Nicholas Resnick, that one. What I'd recommend if you're interested in that kind of question is you should read the book More Heat Than Light by Philip Borowski, which will talk a little bit about that. It's a history of the value concept in economics. And the short version of the story is that the concept of value in economics is the concept of energy in physics with the graph relabeled. So neoclassical economics literally is late 19th century physics with the variables relabeled, and the variable for energy has been relabeled value. So there is a deep history of trying to connect the idea of value in economics to the idea of of energy of some kind, which really dates back to the physiocrats. So Queneau, who's a French economist in the 18th century, who is basically arguing that all wealth comes from the soil originally. And so there is this idea, right, that the metabolic process of the soil and the grain that is grown in the soil is the origin of all value, and everything else is just kind of parasitic on that. And so Borowski will kind of show you the way that this value concept there's this attempt to make it into a metaphor, to locate it in substance of energy or physical processes of some kind. But like, the answers doesn't really work, right? So because the monetary system is subject to these kind of political struggles, it doesn't succeed in being a sign of something real, because it is constantly contingent upon the outcome of political struggles and of different social factions. And so basically it would be possible to believe that money was a sign of value, which was a sign of something that was real, if we believed that the system of money was not subject to political contestation. If it just sort of had its own immanent laws, and that us fighting over it is kind of sterile, because we can't really make it budge from really referring to this thing that it really refers to. I would at least advocate that you entertain a sort of radical constructivist view about value, which is that it is really sort of almost completely arbitrarily socially defined, and it is defined by a political struggle over what really matters, and more importantly, like who really matters and who has the power to decide what matters, right? Kind of the way we were talking about like the military, right? Nobody thinks it's an ontological scandal that we pay soldiers to sit around doing nothing. People do think it's an ontological scandal if we pay me to sit around doing nothing. What's the difference? I mean, so like, why would one of those things make the system of value collapse and the other one wouldn't? I mean, it just makes you skeptical that there really is this. And so I'd read Murawski, and I'd read Nitzen and Bichler, Capital is Power, which is take you through kind of the history of economics. And in order to really answer your question, we need to study the history of economics, which is, a different seminar. But you're right that it's connected. Okay, well, we're time to wrap up. Thank you all very much for going through this material with me. I know it's. I imagine, I hope you are feeling a little bit less lost now that we've got to the end of it. So like I say, I don't think that we have the answers to this, but I'm hoping that at least this kind of sets you on the path of asking the right questions, and sort of, trying to think about this, history of money as being a history of political struggle, and one which is not finished yet, we are living through very interesting times in the history of money. And so just gotta wait and see what happens. Anyway, and so I think some of you are writing papers. I'm looking forward to reading your paper if you're writing it, and feel free to email me and stay in touch if you continue thinking about the stuff that we've been doing. Anyway, well, thank you all so much, and
thank you.
Take care.
Thanks.
Thank you. It was a pleasure, everyone.
Thanks. I have a real quick question. Yeah, if your certificates, this is my first seminar I'm doing for my certificate. Do I have to write a paper?
What? Sorry, can you ask again?
This is the first seminar I'm doing for my certificate. Do I have to write a paper for it?
So you need to have a certain amount of credits to have the whole certificate. You don't have to necessarily write a paper for this one and have this credit, but you can do if you want to have that credit.
Okay.
So for you to have the credit for this class, you have to write a paper for it.
Okay, cool.
But for you to get the amount of credits needed for this certificate, you can also get it from other classes.
Yeah, okay. And so you need to do like one pay, to get 10 credits, you need to do 10.
Yeah, exactly. But if you read in the student handbook, you get credits from meeting with Reza or with another one, or having a meeting with somebody else, but usually it's always with Reza.
Okay.
And you can also have credits from a final work that you do that is not related to any of these classes. So usually credit-related classes are 7-8 credits.
Okay. Yeah, the handbook's a little ambiguous in its wording. I found it a bit.
If you have any specific question, you can email me or some of the organizers at the news center just to be sure about everything. But from my understanding, if you have 7 credits from the seminars alone, that's good for the seminars. And then the other 3 credits you get from other kind of activities.
Yeah, great. Okay, thank you.
And a final piece of work as well. That's also very important for the final credits.
Cool.
Yeah.
And if I'm writing a paper, I should send Colin an email.
Yeah, exactly. Just send the paper to Colin through email. Colin didn't really set up a deadline for the paper. Usually the deadline is either in the last class, which is now, but that is not the case in this seminar.
Yeah.
Usually it's a week after the last class, but I'll just email Colin to be sure of it, and then I can email everyone about the deadline in specific.
Okay, cool. Thank you so much.
Yeah, no biggie.
And can I give feedback? Because I really love this class, and it was like...
Yeah, of course. Everyone is gonna get an email to rate the class according to a specific set of questions, and then you can also do a final note regarding Colin and everything else. Everybody's gonna get a form.
Yeah, nice. If he did another class, I'd definitely do it.
Ah, great. Yeah, put it down on the form. I think he'll be happy to hear that, and the organizers too.
Cool. Right.
Yeah, and as Colin said, you have his email, so if you have any questions for him, I think he'll be happy to reply to them.
Great. Okay. Thanks.
Yeah, no biggie. My pleasure.
Take care.
Have
See you.
a nice weekend.
Enjoy. Ciao.
Ciao.
Mhm.